$2 million vanished from a secured archive within a Detroit banking institution. No alerts, no witnesses, and no immediate suspects. For 5 years, the case remained in storage, unsolvable. Then, during a standard audit, paperwork surfaced that linked identities, access keys, and financial records, transforming what appeared to be a mystery into a matter ready for legal action. In August 1986, Detroit faced a crossroads of decline. The former mighty automotive center of the United States had entered its bleakest period. Manufacturing plants had closed, thousands of positions had disappeared, and complete districts were deteriorating. The municipality's revenue base was contracting while criminal activity escalated in the streets. In this atmosphere of deterioration and suspicion, a robbery took place that stayed hidden from the public, yet echoed quietly through banking and law enforcement communities. Within the lower level of Detroit Federal Savings, a financial establishment already struggling to preserve stability, an event occurred that appeared impossible under ordinary conditions. A portion of the structure was designated as an archival section. It was not a public area. Access demanded high-level authorization or the utilization of particular keys possessed by a limited group of approved staff members. The zone contained steel storage units and vault-type compartments where paperwork and money not documented in official records were kept. These were undocumented funds maintained for internal objectives that never reached oversight agencies or outside auditors. On the morning of August 4th, when personnel arrived to commence regular tasks, a troubling finding was made. Multiple storage units stood ajar and vacant. Money calculated afterward at approximately $2 million had disappeared without leaving evidence. What disturbed investigators most was not merely the magnitude of the deficit, but the technique. The securing mechanisms on the units displayed no indication of interference. The entrances to the lower level had not been broken. The security systems, already basic by contemporary standards, showed no irregular activity throughout the evening. To the personnel on shift, nothing abnormal had occurred. Nevertheless, by sunrise, the money was missing. The institution did not hurry to announce the vanishing official procedures were bypassed, and the management made a deliberate choice to stay quiet. The missing money was not recorded on any official financial statement, which meant their source could not be clarified without exposing dubious internal operations. Confessing the deficit to oversight bodies would generate far more harmful inquiries than it could resolve. For the establishment, the more secure approach was to downplay the incident, manage the situation internally, and hope the account stayed concealed. But the scale of the deficit could not be suppressed entirely. Rumors circulated rapidly, starting within the structure itself. Personnel discussed quietly about empty units, and speculation filtered into the broader financial sector. Soon, pieces of the account reached the Detroit Police Department. Although no formal complaint had been submitted, investigators received information that a significant sum of money had vanished under puzzling circumstances. The police initiated a preliminary inquiry. The initial emphasis was protection. Evening guards were questioned extensively. Each insisted that nothing unusual happened. Security records displayed routine patrols with no absent checkpoints. No unexplained arrivals or departures were documented on the paper forms that functioned as the nightly documentation. Investigators subsequently interrogated the custodial personnel, but officially they had no authorization to the lower level and no purpose to be near the archive section. None mentioned observing suspicious behavior. Uncertainty increased when contradictory testimonies surfaced. Several staff members insisted they had observed individuals with equipment and tools during the evening, describing what resembled maintenance workers. Others were certain that no workers had been arranged and no repairs had been in progress. This discrepancy left investigators without a definite timeline. No bills or work requests emerged to clarify whether maintenance had been genuine or fabricated. With the institution refusing to submit an official loss documentation, federal departments had minimal motivation to allocate resources. The FBI acknowledged the incident, but reduced its priority in the lack of formal proof. Without a complainant, and without any evidence of break-in or force, the matter quickly started to lose momentum. By late 1986, the case had been minimized to a sparse collection of interviews, security records, and conflicting notes. It was labeled and filed with the classification inadequate evidence. Within months, active inquiry ended. The vanishing of $2 million from a basement in Detroit became barely more than an unmentioned secret. For those knowledgeable of it, the matter seemed bound to disappear into folklore. A fortune had vanished in a municipality already overwhelmed by decline. There were no suspects, no scientific leads, no documentation trail. The public stayed uninformed, while within law enforcement, the unanswered inquiry remained. How could such a substantial amount of currency be taken from a protected structure without creating even the tiniest trace of forced access? The quietness of the years that ensued created the impression that the crime had been concealed permanently. Yet, the unresolved details stayed secured in the files. And in the realm of investigations, quietness seldom continues forever. The solution would not emerge through a confession or sudden finding of the missing currency, but through a document long ignored, waiting to appear years afterward, capable of reviving a case considered to be permanently inactive. By the spring of 1991, Detroit was still managing the effects of economic deterioration. A series of mergers, shutdowns, and regulatory inspections moved through banks and insurance corporations across the municipality. Financial establishments that had survived the upheaval of the preceding decade, now confronted, required audits. It was in this setting of examination and documentation that a finding emerged, not through police activity or confessions, but through standard review of old files stored in dusty containers. Inside one of the storage areas of a structure connected to Detroit Federal Savings, a team of auditors examined volumes of forgotten documents. The assignment was clerical, to confirm insurance compliance and balance records before a merger. The procedure was tedious, involving the categorization of payroll records, vendor receipts, and security documentation. Among the stacks of faded folders, an unusually slim register attracted their notice. It was a record book utilized to document requests for temporary entry to restricted zones of the institution. Such papers were typically straightforward, showing dates, approved signatures, and short descriptions of maintenance activities. Yet, this specific book held an entry that interrupted the pattern. The entry was dated August 3, 1986, the exact evening when millions in unrecorded money had vanished from the basement archive. It recorded the provision of a temporary contractor's permit, supposedly for a locksmith allocated to maintenance duties. What made the line notable was the originator code. It corresponded to the identification once utilized by a staff member named Monet Wilkins, who had worked in the administrative division until 1985. Personnel documents confirmed she had departed the institution a complete year before the robbery. Her identity should not have appeared in any file after that date, and definitely not as the originator of a permit connected to restricted entry. Additional examination of the entry disclosed an attached request form containing a signature that was submitted for handwriting analysis. The determination was clear. The writing belonged to Wilkins. This created substantial questions about how her approval and code continued to operate in the system long after her exit. As auditors investigated further, another concerning discrepancy emerged. The master key allocated to Wilkins during her employment had a documentation card in the institution's key management ledger. Usually, upon termination, such keys were returned and recorded as received. In her situation, the card stayed open with no notation of return. The oversight suggested that the submaster key connected to her identity could still have been available in August 1986. The irregularities did not conclude there. In the accounting department of an external contractor, an archived work request was found dated the same evening as the robbery. It detailed planned repairs in the basement of the institution. A concluding comment on the document, however, contained a handwritten note, "Work not completed." That short statement indicated that a contractor had allegedly been present, yet no repair had occurred. Combined with the permit entry and the unreturned key, the discrepancies created a troubling image. What appeared was not a minor clerical error, but a series of files suggesting intentional manipulation. An originator no longer employed, a key that stayed active, and a work request connected to an event that had never happened formed a chain that could not be disregarded. Each paper individually might have been dismissed as a mistake, but collectively they indicated preparation and planning behind the vanishing of currency. The principal auditor supervising this section of the examination was Kendra Lawson. Educated to recognize discrepancies that could reveal liability, she comprehended that the finding had consequences far beyond insurance reconciliation. She assembled the relevant papers and elevated them to her supervisors, who subsequently forwarded the details to law enforcement. For Lawson, the choice was procedural, part of her professional obligation. For the Detroit Police Department, it was far more significant. The discoveries arrived on the desk of Detective Tony Harrell, who examined the collection of papers with increasing interest. The record entry, the key file, and the incomplete work request together supplied something the matter had lacked for years, a concrete lead that connected the 1986 vanishing to identifiable individuals and procedures. The robbery that had once appeared destined to stay concealed now returned to the center of attention. The irregularity found in a forgotten ledger transformed a dormant case into an active inquiry. The details indicated toward a carefully planned entry into the basement archive, and for the first time since the deficit was found, the possibility of reconstructing how it had been executed became real. The quietness that had surrounded the crime for half a decade was interrupted by the rediscovery of several overlooked pages. By the summer of 1991, Detective Tony Harrell had the authority to reopen a case that had remained dormant for half a decade. He approached the assignment with the systematic precision of a career investigator who understood the significance of detail. His initial step was to consolidate the discoveries delivered by auditors with the internal files of Detroit Federal Savings. The irregularities identified in the access record could not be examined in isolation. They had to be cross-referenced with employment histories and departmental duties. Personnel documents confirmed that Monet Wilkins had worked in the institution's administrative division until the middle of 1985. Her position gave her supervision of contractor scheduling and the provision of temporary permits for outside workers. Every request for entry into non-public zones passed across her desk, and she had the power to generate the required forms and signatures. It became evident that during her tenure, she developed extensive familiarity with internal procedures, particularly how keys were monitored and how maintenance requests were handled. The exact system designed to control movement inside the structure was one she had helped oversee. When she was terminated, files showed that her submaster key should have been surrendered and recorded. Yet, Harrell found that the planned replacement of locks in the basement, scheduled as part of cost reduction measures, had been postponed indefinitely. As a consequence, the key allocated to Wilkins still operated the locks even after her departure. The fact that her identification appeared on a record entry dated a year later suggested that her knowledge of the system did not conclude when she left her position. After establishing this background, Harrell examined the circle of staff members who had interacted with Wilkins during her time at the institution. He sorted through the identities of clerical personnel, maintenance teams, and security guards, comparing their files with the timeline of the vanishing. None of the guards had suspicious patterns in their employment record. Clerical personnel appeared consistent in their positions. Then one identity stood out: Darnell Maddox, a custodian allocated to overnight shifts. Maddox had resigned suddenly in August 1986, just days after the robbery was discovered. This timeline alone could not function as proof, but Harrell considered it too significant to ignore Maddox had entry to the structure at evening, the exact window when the robbery occurred. His position may have appeared low-level, but it positioned him in proximity to restricted zones. To test whether Maddox had appeared elsewhere after leaving Detroit, Harrell submitted requests through interagency networks and traced his movements to Chicago. The results were remarkable. By 1988, Maddox was recorded as co-owner of an auto wash and, shortly after, part of a retail enterprise dealing in car components. The primary incorporator of these ventures was his cousin, Marcus Tate, but financial files indicated initial currency deposits that did not correspond with their reported earnings. The contribution of capital, deposited in late 1988, significantly exceeded what a custodian's salary could reasonably explain. Neither enterprise carried evidence of loans or outside investors, which suggested that the source of money had been entirely in currency. For Harrell, this was the first concrete connection that joined a former administrative staff member who could create the documentation for entry with a custodian who had both opportunity and a sudden unexplained improvement in circumstances. The connection was circumstantial, but it outlined a plausible pathway: a forged or misused permit, an active submaster key, and someone inside the structure at evening who could physically remove the currency. The detective's task now shifted from collecting irregularities to constructing a prosecutable matter. Papers alone would not be sufficient. The gaps had to be filled with corroborated evidence. That meant securing interviews, conducting financial examinations, and, if warranted, requesting search warrants. The strategy was to move carefully, ensuring that each piece of information could withstand scrutiny in court. For the first time since 1986, the inquiry was active. Leads existed, suspects had been identified, and the outlines of a conspiracy began to take shape. The dormant case, once thought to be nothing more than a story whispered in financial circles, now had identities and timelines. Harrell understood that transforming coincidence into certainty required persistence, and he prepared to push deeper. The matter that had stalled at the edge of silence was finally moving forward, and with every file examined, the possibility of exposing how the money had vanished became more tangible. By the autumn of 1991, the inquiry had entered a decisive phase. What had begun as a trail of archival irregularities now produced two clear identities. Monet Wilkins, once an administrative staff member with entry to internal systems, and Darnell Maddox, a former custodian who had left the institution suddenly, both appeared in papers connected to the evening of the robbery. To law enforcement, these were no longer vague coincidences, but individuals whose past choices and present circumstances required close examination. The first step was to bring Wilkins in for questioning. She had rebuilt her life since leaving the institution and was employed by an insurance company, maintaining a routine that projected stability. Yet, financial files from the mid-1980s painted a different picture. Credit card statements revealed persistent debt, repayment delays, and balances that increased after her dismissal in 1985. Salary reductions and the abrupt end of her employment coincided with a period of financial stress that could have motivated risky choices. Investigators viewed these files not as proof, but as context that explained why she might have been willing to misuse her entry. During her session, Wilkins rejected any link to the robbery. The signature on the contractor request, she claimed, was falsified, but handwriting experts concluded that the writing matched her samples. This contradiction weakened her credibility. The issue of the submaster key created further problems. Official ledgers showed that the key tied to her identity had never been returned. The absence of a final entry in the control card was more than clerical negligence. It suggested that the key had remained available beyond her employment. That file became one of the most critical pieces against her. At the same time, attention shifted to Maddox. Unlike Wilkins, his trajectory after leaving the institution led investigators across state lines. In Chicago, he appeared on incorporation documents as the owner of an auto wash and as co-owner of an automotive component store. The papers recorded a substantial currency investment in 1988, a figure entirely inconsistent with the known income of a custodian. Maddox insisted through counsel that the money came from his cousin Marcus Tate, who had signed as a partner. To test this explanation, investigators reviewed Tate's financial disclosures. They found no trace of earnings or transactions that could account for the contribution. The discrepancy signaled that Maddox's new ventures may have been funded by resources hidden since the vanishing in 1986. Further scrutiny of institution personnel files uncovered details about Maddox's departure. In his termination documentation, the official note read, "Resigned voluntarily, effective immediately." The urgency of the wording set his case apart from routine resignations. For investigators, this pointed toward a choice made under pressure, possibly to avoid exposure. His swift exit from employment, just days after the vanishing, supported the theory that he had played an operational role. With mounting indications against both individuals, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office compiled a comprehensive package and submitted it to authorities in Illinois. The request sought judicial approval to conduct searches of the Chicago properties linked to Maddox and Tate. A court in Cook County issued the warrants, and the operation was carried out with local law enforcement coordinating alongside visiting detectives from Detroit. The searches targeted business premises and associated files. Investigators located ledgers that documented large currency deposits between 1988 and 1989. The figures matched neither declared wages nor any bank loans. The books contained no references to credit facilities or external investors. Instead, they recorded injections of money that appeared suddenly and without financial background. The discoveries directly supported the hypothesis that proceeds from the robbery had been channeled into legitimate enterprises to mask their origin. The results of the operation strengthened the matter significantly. By late 1991, law enforcement had more than 2 identities on a list. They had a structured body of evidence that tied Wilkins and Maddox to the missing money. Still, the inquiry had one essential task ahead: reconstructing the events of that August evening in precise detail and showing how a fortune had been removed from a secured facility under the watch of guards and internal controls. Only then could prosecutors transform suspicion into a matter capable of holding in court. The accumulated evidence allowed investigators to piece together the chain of events that had unfolded during the evening of August 3, 1986. The picture that emerged was not of a spontaneous robbery, but of a plan executed with knowledge of internal systems and the cooperation of individuals who understood how to mask their actions behind legitimate documentation. At the administrative level, Monet Wilkins had held a position that granted her authority over contractor entry requests. Before her dismissal in 1985, she handled forms for maintenance crews, locksmiths, and cleaning teams. That experience gave her intimate knowledge of how files were created, approved, and archived. Evidence showed that she had prepared an application for contractor entry that appeared routine on paper. It listed maintenance as the reason for entry into the basement and followed the usual format, complete with her identification and signature. No one questioned the entry at the time, and the permit functioned as legitimate authorization for presence in the restricted zone. The physical key added a second layer of opportunity. When Wilkins left her job, the submaster key tied to her role should have been returned and deactivated in the system. Files confirmed that replacement of the cylinders had been delayed as part of budget constraints. This meant the key continued to function, as if nothing had changed. Its survival past her employment created the essential tool for entry. Investigators concluded that this key provided unrestricted entry to the units where off-the-books money was stored. The operational side fell to Darnell Maddox, whose role as a night custodian gave him a plausible reason to move through the structure after hours. His duties involved cleaning offices, disposing of waste, and transporting materials using a service cart. Investigators reconstructed that, on the evening in question, he entered the basement archive, opened the units with the key, and began transferring bundles of currency into containers that resembled discarded documents. He covered them with bags of refuse and cleaning supplies, disguising their contents. Guards observing his movement would have seen nothing unusual. A custodian with a cart leaving through a service exit was an expected sight during the quiet hours of evening operations. From there, the containers were loaded into a vehicle positioned discreetly at the rear of the property. No forced entry and no alarms meant that the entire operation passed as routine activity. By morning, the unit stood empty, and no one had registered an irregularity during the evening. The robbery, executed without confrontation, blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the institution's normal maintenance cycle. Once the money left the structure, the conspirators faced the challenge of concealment. Investigators established that the currency was taken to Chicago, where Maddox had family connections. Initially, the money were not placed in circulation. For nearly 2 years, the containers remained untouched. This waiting period was consistent with an attempt to let suspicions fade, allowing the robbery to sink deeper into obscurity as the institution avoided publicity and law enforcement moved on. By 1988, the money began to surface in legitimate channels. Business incorporation files in Illinois documented the creation of an auto wash, followed by an automotive component store. Both enterprises were structured under the identity of Maddox's cousin, Marcus Tate, with Maddox himself also listed. The seed capital for these businesses was deposited in currency, with no bank loans or credit arrangements tied to the ventures. This strategy effectively laundered the money, presenting them as legitimate investments in small businesses rather than unexplained currency linked to an unresolved robbery. For investigators, the reconstruction formed a coherent sequence. It began with the documentation generated by Wilkins, continued through the physical entry enabled by the retained key, and culminated in Maddox's use of his custodial role to transport the currency under the guise of routine cleaning. The abrupt resignation of Maddox following the robbery, combined with the sudden emergence of currency-driven enterprises in another state, aligned seamlessly with the pattern of a carefully organized scheme. The matter, once considered an urban mystery, now stood on a framework supported by documentation and logical inference. The investigators had transitioned from unexplained gaps to a narrative that explained each stage, how entry was gained, how removal occurred, and how the money resurfaced years later in the form of businesses operating openly in Chicago. What began as the chance discovery of a misplaced record book had expanded into a full reconstruction of a multi-million-dollar crime. By the close of 1991, the police possessed a version of events that could be presented with confidence. It explained how a robbery once thought impossible had been accomplished through insider knowledge, administrative oversight, and patient concealment. The next challenge was to transform this reconstruction into evidence capable of withstanding the scrutiny of a courtroom. At the beginning of 1992, the inquiry that had once seemed destined to fade into obscurity finally reached the courtroom. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office formally filed charges against Darnell Maddox and Monet Wilkins, presenting an indictment that drew heavily on the extensive work of auditors and detectives. The evidence package was built on layers of documentation, entry records from 1986, the unresolved status of a submaster key, the forged contractor request, the results of financial searches in Illinois, and the business ledgers that revealed currency infusions inconsistent with declared income, each element reinforced the others, constructing a matter that explained how millions of dollars had vanished 6 years earlier. The trial began in Wayne County Circuit Court, attracting attention within law enforcement circles, even though the public remained largely unaware of the scale of the robbery. Proceedings extended over several months as prosecutors carefully introduced evidence to establish a chain of circumstantial facts. They called handwriting experts to confirm that the contractor application bore the signature of Wilkins. Specialists in document control explained the significance of the missing return notation for the key, showing how its continued validity aligned with the timeline of the robbery. Financial analysts demonstrated how businesses in Chicago received large currency deposits during a narrow period beginning in 1988, deposits that could not be linked to wages, loans, or any legitimate revenue source. Defense attorneys countered by emphasizing what was absent from the matter. No currency from the robbery had been recovered. No direct witness had testified to seeing Maddox remove containers of currency. The contractors whose identities appeared in the original work order denied involvement, and no surveillance footage existed from 1986 to capture the events. The defense argued that the entire prosecution rested on inference rather than proof. They sought to frame the financial growth of Maddox's businesses as entrepreneurial success supported by family contributions, and they attempted to dismiss the irregularities in the entry files as clerical errors. Despite these challenges, the prosecution's matter gained strength from the consistency of its narrative. Each separate irregularity, when viewed alone, could be questioned. Together they formed a coherent story that explained not only how entry was obtained, but also how the proceeds later surfaced. The urgency of Maddox's resignation, the absence of any file of key returned by Wilkins, the currency-driven expansion in another state, and the expert confirmation of her handwriting all pointed in one direction. The court recognized that circumstantial evidence, if consistent and compelling, could sustain a conviction. In June 1992, the court delivered its verdict. Darnell Maddox was found guilty of robbery within a structure and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 12 years of incarceration, citing the scale of the robbery and the breach of trust within a financial establishment as aggravating factors. The businesses established under the identities of his relatives were seized under forfeiture statutes, classified as assets purchased with proceeds of crime. Monet Wilkins faced sentencing as an accessory. The court acknowledged that her role had been secondary but essential. Without her knowledge of entry systems and her ability to generate authentic documentation, the robbery could not have occurred in the manner reconstructed by investigators. She had cooperated during parts of the inquiry and had no prior criminal history. Taking these factors into account, the judge imposed a sentence of 5 years of probation with conditions that barred her from employment in financial establishments. With the convictions, the matter officially closed. For investigators who had reopened the case after years of silence, the outcome validated their persistence. For the Detroit Police Department, the resolution provided an example of how old matters could resurface through routine administrative discovery. For the municipality, the matter stood as a reminder that hidden systems of currency and unmonitored practices created vulnerabilities ripe for exploitation. The robbery had been buried for 6 years, but the eventual exposure showed that time did not erase accountability. In Detroit, where economic decline had created shadows for crime to flourish, the exposure of the 1986 robbery reinforced the principle that even the most carefully executed plan could not remain invisible forever.